These pliers, as you can see, have had the tips cut off, a hole drilled in the top, in the end, to suit the diameter of the rewind button. That worked very well. The ideal tool to do that with is a nice cheap pair of pliers with nice soft steel, because it's no fun drilling the hole in the end. Okay, so here's our rewind button, its return spring and its washer. The washer is very important, it's not an optional extra. Take the screw out here on the sprocket shaft. This screw couples the sprocket to the sprocket shaft, and I should be able to push that up out of the way. No, I can't because it's held by that other thing. Let's get that out of the way. I swing that lever out of the way. I can push up my sprocket shaft, lift the sprocket out of the camera. Back down to the bottom of the camera here. This is our release shaft. This is the catch for our rewind button. We can take that off. I'll unhook its spring, remove that screw, all of these parts are dirty and gummy with dried up grease and dust. Now, having said that, this is not the first time this camera has been apart by the looks of it, and it's very likely that it probably looked even worse at one stage in its life. So here, let's get this film advanced. If we get that round to its rest position, which would be there, we have access to 3 screw heads visible down those holes. Now they'll hold our advanced shaft in position. Sometimes the screws are not easy to get your screwdriver into because the slots may be a little bit closed up. Okay, so if I've undone those, we can lift that out. If I pull that back, I've got access to the 3 screws. Now these screws are typically nickel plated screws. Every now and then you'll find a camera where they would run out of nickel plated screws and they used the chrome plated screws that should have been in the top cover. In which case you put those chrome plated screws carefully to one side because they're hard to find. Okay, so this fell out from the top of the camera. That's that bush from the top of the film advance. This is the drum that sits underneath it. This has the clutch in it. The clutch's job is to provide some controlled friction between the movement of the take-up spool and the sprocket. The sprocket is driven by a gear, so it's timed if you like. The drum is just driven at the end through that clutch. As more film builds up on the drum as you go through your film in the camera, because it's effectively a larger and larger diameter as it goes on, it's pulling more and more film through, or attempting to pull more and more film through the camera than the sprocket's actually feeding. So if there's no slippage, you would find that the take-up spool will pull the film past the sprocket, or attempt to, which would rip the film to pieces. So there needs to be controlled slippage, and frequently with old cameras everything is gummed up, and as a result there's no slippage, and then the film starts getting ripped to bits. So this is our take-up spool. It's just a plastic spool. There's a little metal bush in the base of it. That doesn't like being in contact with naphtha, so limit the amount of naphtha that it goes on that. Okay, so our film advance is all out of the camera. That only leaves us our cocking piece here really, which slides up and down. This is being turned by the film advance as it rotates. It would pull that action backwards and forwards, and this is very gummy. This is probably why the film advance was a bit sticky in this camera. Anything else needs to come in? We've got our release lever here. The release lever's job is to allow the film advance lever to move again, to be able to allow you to wind on to the next shot after you've released the shutter. So I'm just removing the screw from the top of that shaft. I've got it and its return spring. I can push that release lever out of the camera, and this spring on the tip of that release lever, that's very important. If that's not present or if it's broken, it means that instead of this being pushed inwards so it contacts the cam and controls the action of the film advance, it flops around. Now this spring is a little bit misshapen. I'm going to take it off there just by wriggling it carefully, and I'll put that to one side. I don't want that going through the cleaner. Back to the camera body. There's nothing exciting left in there now except for this cocking stuff here. So let's have a look at that. I'm going to remove the front of the camera. There's two screws. Leave these nameplates alone. You have no reason to remove those. Some of these screws are very tight. May indicate someone tightened them up. It may indicate grease got in there and turned to lacquer at a later date. Right, so I'll lift this front plate off. Here you can see the lever that releases the shutter. You can see that bar there. Well, the shutter release shaft, which is where it's here somewhere, the shutter release shaft passes through the body here. Well, I can find the right, where is the release? There it is. Passes through the body there. I can line it up with the hole. Yeah. And that will press on that lever you can see in there and rotate it. And as that rotates the lever in the back of the shutter and releases the shutter. Let's have that shutter release back out. You be careful with that not to lose the spring at all times. So this lever can come out. It's just sitting in there. This is very gummy with old grease, so it doesn't move as freely as it should do. This shaft is the shaft that cocks the shutter. Now its neutral position is sitting much like that, with that D-shaped hole, the flap pointing upwards. And as this is pulled forward by the mechanism, it rotates that and cocks the shutter. Then it returns to the rest position. That shaft should lift out. I'm just looking closely to see where its rest position is. With this all the way back against stop, this is sitting, its D shape if you like, is sitting at this sort of angle, not quite flat. If I pull it forward just slightly, it would be sitting flat. That's its rest position, but just taking note of where that is by pushing that back, I can see it's there. So we can lift that out. This is a gear that couples with the lever in here, the slot on it. It's a little rack. Now to get at that rack, there's two things we need to do. First of all, we need to remove this screw. And you can see that's a shoulder screw. it passes through that slot in that black arm. Is that a collar on there? No, that's part of that rack. Okay. So to get this piece out, to get this rack out of here, we need to remove this front section. The front section is held in by 2 screws at the top and 2 screws at the bottom of the camera. This front section takes the place of the black shroud that goes around the bellows on a Retina camera. And there are 2 screws on the base of the camera which are here hidden by the glue and rubbish in that leatherette. Let's put a drop of naphtha on there and probably vain hope that it'll soften that adhesive and I'll be able to get those screws out. No, that screw is coming out. Quite commonly they don't.
Coffee through here.
Thank you. Those screws came out very easily. Right. This front section, it should lift out. I don't think there's anything else holding it left in place. It's catching on something. That sliding piece there, it doesn't want to clear. See if it comes up at an angle. We've got one stop, one more screw I can take out. That forms the stop for the shutter release. It controls the depth you're able to depress the shutter release. I think that's the only fastener I've got left in there. We'll remove it anyway. I'm not sure whether that's stopping us or not. Doesn't look like it was. Okay, to this piece. Can that be swung across in any way? Oh, it will come out. It's got to be pushed under the body there. Yeah, see, it was catching up in the body. So here's that rack. You can see it's got teeth on it. It's also covered in very thick dried grease. You can even see, oh, look at the colour of that. That looks like the dreaded green grease. All of this filth has got to come off. You can see in the camera body. There's a big wodge of grease there. All this was sticking it together. Alright, well the leatherette here is peeling up a bit, so I want to glue that back, which I'll do after I've cleaned up everything else. And I'll show you how I clean this stuff up. And I'll put all this to one side and we'll take one of the other the later camera apart and see how that differs. I don't expect it differs by much. Well, the mid-production one looked very similar to the early production, so we'll just leave that aside for the moment. We'll concentrate on the later production and look at the differences with this model. So, most likely, the big change is going to be at this component here. Everything else looks much the same. I'll remove the stuff from the top. Now this chrome trim plate is underneath the strap lugs at both ends of the camera. So we'll remove that. In the other camera there was no need to remove the strap lug at this end of the camera because it was obstructing nothing. And I'll take out the rewind while I'm here, just because I can, and it's convenient too. Now, unlike the Retinas, there's no two-stage lift on the rewind, so you can't lift the knob up to rewind your film. You rewind the film with the knob in the down position. Yeah, 2 screws here on the strap lug. And this chrome trim plate comes off. The remainder of this looks very much the same as the early camera, with the exception of this connection at this point. We might as well prepare by removing the leatherettes from the base of the camera, and that always starts with the leatherette disc on the film advance lever. This appears to be stuck very well, and so it could be a problem getting this up. Here I'm endeavouring to get my scalpel blade under the edge of that disc, and then working back towards the centre to lift it off. This does not look like it's been serviced before. I'm not seeing 2 types of adhesive on there. Three screws for the film advance lever. Remove the screws here that hold the back catch cover and tripod sockets around in place. That screw looks a bit blurred over. I'm having trouble getting my screwdriver in there. Might be just filth in the slot. A smaller screwdriver will do it for me. If these screws have backed out slightly and the camera receives lots of handling, the heads of the screws get damaged, and as a result they can be very difficult to remove. There's our return spring and the back catch cover. Okay, so we've got the leatherette to remove. Now, it appeared from the film advance lever that the leatherette's not been off before. So we'll see if I'm correct in that assumption, and that might mean it's easy, or it might mean it's difficult to get the leatherette off. It seems to be coming off fairly well. The leatherette is certainly in much better condition, probably because it's been glued only once, and with an adhesive that was chosen at the factory to the best of their knowledge, one that would do the job well. Sometimes it turns out that the materials used were not the ideal for the job, but typically you only find that out years afterwards. Okay, so that was easy. Now, unlike the other camera that only had a little plate at this end, this has their full chrome trim plate, which serves much the same purpose and needs to come off. We got them all. There's one more disguised here. They can be very hard to see in that dried adhesive and the residue from the base of the leatherette. So we'll take that plate off And I'll take this opportunity to change my camera battery because it's moaning that it's flat. Okay, what's the tripod socket like? Are the screws loose? Yes, they are. Well, I might as well have those out in that case, and the tripod socket can be cleaned with the rest of the stuff. And that little piece there, which was in the hole, that's where your film cassette sits. That forms the hole in the middle, bottom of the chamber where your film cassette will sit neatly. Okay, so this. Let's have the rewind knob off. Same deal, I'm using my pliers that have been modified. That was actually loose. That's unusual. The button, the spring and its washer. We have a single screw visible here that couples the sprocket and the sprocket shaft together. At the top here, right, let's take out that screw, and I've got that screwdriver I've made by cutting away the middle part basically. I've got a video or a couple of videos on my channel on how to make helpful tools like that. Okay, this bracket is easily removable because it sits into this rack, sits into the slot in that rack, and if you turn it, it locks into position. If you turn it to 45 degrees, you can lift it out. So that's out of the way. These components, we've got the washer. These are probably the same as we've just dealt with. That was just the Film Advance spring completely unwinding. That sound. And these parts are dirty and greasy, but look to be in good order. We have the same deal here. Screw on this side, shoulder screw. Has the return spring around the top. Sits in a groove around the top of the screw. We have the pawl that stops the Film Advance mechanism from backing up, and the little standoff that goes underneath it. Right, our sprocket shaft should just about lift out now. I've got the screw out. Why is that reluctant? It might be catching on the gear under here. We slacken this screw off, it'll come out. There's not much clearance under here, and sometimes the two will foul each other. There you go. But not in the working position, only when you're trying to get them out. Top of our Film Advance, this is the bush, the guide bush for the top of the Film Advance shaft. Has this pinion set on it. Here's the clutch. You've already seen the clutch in the earlier camera. 3 pieces. The inner, which is coupled to this spring at that tab there. And the outer drum. And the spring tension against the inside of the drum provides our drive. You need controlled slippage there. If that's really gummed up with dried grease, you don't have controlled slippage, and then the film gets torn. Right, so I'm going to hold my finger on the bottom of this release shaft here and undo the screw at the top. Being careful not to lose the return spring off there. It's fortunately, as you wind the screw out, the spring is not under tension and it's not so prone to running away. and we can lift out our release lever, and again, like the other cameras, is identical. It's got a spring on the base of it, which is a little bit misshapen. It's not sitting flat. I'm going to put that to one side. That's going to have to be straightened out before it goes back on, and this other piece, this release lever, can go through the cleaner. And you've heard me mentioning the cleaner frequently. Well, the cleaner is the I put all these components into a tin full of wax and grease remover, and then I suspend that tin in the ultrasonic cleaner surrounded by water, and the ultrasonic waves pass through the water, pass through the tin into the solvent, and it does a wonderful job of moving all the old filth and grease. I'm just removing the screw here from the middle of the back, the rewind button catch. Shoulder screw, 2 shoulders, one for the spring and one for the lever. That lever's job is to lock the rewind button in, so you don't have to hold your finger on it while you're rewinding the film, and is when you move the film advance lever, that swings that lever back out of the way, allows the rewind button to pop back up and for the film advance to carry on doing its normal job. Okay, so we've got 3 screws visible here. Now this is obligingly sitting exactly at the rest position, so can see those 3 screws. And I'll retrieve those 3 screws from that plate. Here's the plate now. This is our film advance shaft. If you're going to have problems with this, one problem that you can have is that where the plate's riveted on the bottom, sometimes that can be loose. Now when it's loose, it's usually down to one cause. The camera has been dropped, it's hit the film advance lever on the ground, which has applied a lot of force to this area here and effectively mutilated the metal. They can be re-riveted with mixed success, but it's nice when you don't have to. This is the return spring that gives us our tension to return the advance lever to its rest position. Right, so we open the back of the camera. We should now be able to fish out the sprocket and the take-up spool, and the take-up spool has this little metal bush in the base. Excuse me. Well, this is pretty stripped down. I'll pull the shutter out, and I'm using this tool. And if you haven't got that tool, you can fight with it with various other tools, maybe like this, which was a pair of circlip pliers that have had the ends mutilated. Now the flash contact here, typically that's screwed into a little plastic connector. This one's been soldered. That tells me that most likely the shutter's been serviced once before, even if nothing else on the camera has. So I'll just get my soldering iron, melt that connection, and we can lift the shutter off the front. Okay, so that shutter is off. I can put that to one side with its shims and with its retaining ring. Back to the camera body. So, how does this one differ to the previous camera? Well, obviously it has a flash connection on the front plate and a cable connecting to the flash connection. 2 screws hold this casting in place on the front. The casting just lifts off. As before, here's our shutter release. You can see it's very gummy with thick dried grease. This is the piece that couples to our cocking action here. This is probably not so easy to set the position of as the other camera. Let's get the lever in place. We know that in its rest position. Okay, so when this is all the way pushed down towards the rewind end, let's have a look at that. That's sitting at about the 45-degree mark, the angle of that. And that's sitting in its neutral start position there, the D, the flat of the D to the top of the camera. And this is sitting directly over the centre of the film advance lever. If we don't get that position right, it might be difficult to cock the shutter, but it's not impossible to set that back correctly afterwards. Right, we can lift this out. This plate on the front, 2 screws at the top, 2 screws at the base. Will the screws come out? Yes. And will this plate lift out? Yeah, it's going to. It was very reluctant on the other camera. Right, there's a baffle, loose baffle there in the camera body. Take note of that. It only goes in one way. There are 2 projections in the casting. Or was it 1 in this case? Yeah, 1 in this case. That sits in there. That one's got a cutout where a screw runs through, but it can only go in one way. So there's our camera body, finished with basically. Here's the casting, and this was the piece we were interested in. That's that little rack. It serves like a cocking rack basically. It's pulled along and it rotates this business, which in turn cocks the shutter. And this is all just dirty and greasy with 1,000-year-old grease. And the camera body needs to be cleaned out. There's a lot of dust and grit here. That's hardly surprising given the age of it. But there's no more needs to be taken out of that body because we've got everything out of interest. Okay, so those pieces need to be put aside for cleaning. Let's have a quick look at this casting. Well, the leatherettes on the front of the camera appear to be quite firmly fixed, so I'm not going to mess with those. The leatherette on the back is poor. We've got Zeiss bumps in various places, but what's more concerning is this. Now, I think that most likely that solvent damaged it, that solvent has damaged that. It fits nicely where your thumb would fit as you pick a camera up, but I mean you'd have to have your hands soaked in solvent to do that, so that's probably just a coincidence that it's a thumb-shaped mark there. It's not really how you'd hold it. I think solvent's got onto there. What sort of solvent, I don't know. Naphtha wouldn't make that mess. Or not easily. Something more aggressive than naphtha. Petrol probably would. Gasoline. Either way, the leatherette is effectively ruined. You can't restore that finish. That's a great big piece of finish just effectively gone. We may have to live with that because I probably don't have a better piece of leatherette with retinette neatly embossed on it that would cover that. Not in that pattern. I probably do for the Retinette 1As, but I don't think they had the name on the back. Anyway, we're probably going to have to live with that. On the base of the camera, this is dried adhesive and a little bit of corrosion. The white stuff's corrosion, and the black stuff is mostly fibres from the back of the Leatherette. So I just want that rubbish off there so that when I come to glue my Leatherettes back on, we're gluing them to a clean surface with no lumps and bumps. Because though it would be nice to think that all the lumps on here would key nicely into hollows on the Leatherette, you can guarantee that's not going to happen. So here I'm using the back edge of my scalpel just to scrape that rubbish loose. It's quite brittle and it scrapes away quite easily. So that's all that's involved in that, and I'll give this a clean with a bit of solvent before I do anything else with it. There's a bit of stuff here I haven't got to. You don't need to dig into the metal to get rid of that stuff. It's just loose. It's just stuff on the surface really we're worried about getting rid of. It's just to make sure that we have the best possible chance of getting the Leatherette to stick back easily. Okay, so now I'm checking the fit of the back, and the back snaps shut fairly well. Looking at the catch, it's not showing any signs of rust. Often they do if it's been somewhere damp. And inside the camera body you can see there's a lot of dirt and dust and rubbish in there, a bit of dried grease. That'll all need to be cleaned out. That's quite normal, and if the camera hasn't had any major service done in the last 65 years, it would be exceptionally unusual to find it clean and tidy in the back. Okay, well I'll just take a quick mental survey here of what I've got in front of me and where all the pieces go, and we may have a look at a third camera body.